And now I'd like to turn things over to League Member Elizabeth Lentini, who will introduce tonight's program.
Everybody, I'm Elizabeth Lentini. I'm a member of the Milwaukee County League of Women Voters. And I am delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, and welcome. Our presenter tonight is Sarah Eskrich, who is the Executive Director of Democracy Found, which is a Wisconsin-based nonpartisan organization. Democracy Found, by the way, don't mix it up with Democracy Fund, because I kept doing that when I was first trying to find out information. It's Democracy Fund. It's a Wisconsin-based nonpartisan organization, which was co-founded in 2018 by Wisconsin business leaders Catherine Gale and Austin Ramirez. It's based on Gale's idea to use competition theory to diagnose our political system's problems and to create solutions. That's where the Final Five voting idea came from. This idea has garnered support from Wisconsin business leaders as well as members of the Wisconsin legislature from both sides of the aisle. Sarah has an admirable record of public service, which I'd like to just highlight quickly. She has served on the Madison Common Council and is currently a commissioner on the Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District. She's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds 2 master's degrees from that esteemed institution. She has a master's in public affairs from the La Follette School and a master's in public health from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Sarah has agreed to answer questions after her presentation. So if you have a question for her, you can type it into the chat at any time. Just know that the chat is not going to be available to be seen by all of you. It will go to Peggy, who will tee up the questions for Sarah. Actually, Sarah will see them, I think, as well. If you aren't already muted, we have muted everyone. And if you haven't already muted, please mute yourself if you're not already muted. Yeah, so we'll address questions at the end. Okay, so I'm very delighted to hand everything over to Sarah Eskrich of Democracy Found.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks, Peggy, for setting this up this evening. I'm really pleased to be with you all. Let me throw up my slides here quickly. Great. So Elizabeth really said so much about me and the work in that brief background. So let me just add that you heard a little bit about my work in public service. I've also been a policy person, not particularly on election reform. I spent about a decade working in health policy prior to coming over to work for Democracy Found about 3 years ago. And I've also been involved in partisan politics. But this effort, this totally systemic, nonpartisan effort, really spoke to me, honestly, from both of those vantage points of my work on policy-oriented solutions, where so often we knew what we needed to do in my particular area of healthcare to make the system better, but politics would get in the way of anything getting done, and vice versa. So when I learned about this work that Catherine Gale had done on industry competition in politics, it was like a light bulb moment, really explained so much of what I was personally experiencing in the policy world, but also in the political world. And I couldn't help but roll up my sleeves and get involved. So let me start quickly with a Venn diagram that I think will strike a chord with many of you, particularly League members, based on your experience in politics. It certainly strikes the chord for me. That is to say, this is supposed to be a Venn diagram. There should be an intersection, but as you can see, there is actually no intersection right now between Congress acting in the public interest and the likelihood of their getting reelected. So in other words, if our elected representatives do their jobs in the way that we want and need them to do, they're likely to lose those jobs, which is crazy design. And fortunately, it's what we're going to talk about how we fix today. So the answer to that problem really lies in understanding the design of the industry, the system itself. So rather than go into the details of the analysis that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, I'll just recommend to you all Catherine Gale's book with Michael Porter from Harvard Business School, and summarize it for you today by saying that the key to any industry, to healthy industries, is competition, because competition drives accountability and results, right? You're incentivized to serve your customers because if they aren't getting what they want from you, they'll go elsewhere in the market. That's what competition drives. So there seems to be something going wrong in politics when we know that people are dissatisfied, right? Congress's approval rating never really goes higher than 20% these days. And yet, nearly 90% of congressional races are not competitive. They are deemed uncompetitive. So furthermore, just to drill in how misaligned that is right now in our politics, in the 2020 election, which was one of the highest turnout elections in recent history, effectively 10% of the population elected 83% of our members of Congress. That is crazy design. So before I go further, let me just pause and tell you, on our work, we're not on the blue team or the red team. We think it's crazy design that in any way, 10% of the population should elect 86% of the members of Congress, regardless of what team they are on. Our work actually doesn't even focus on the individual politicians on either side of the aisle as being the problem, because the root cause of our political dysfunction, and this is something that I think many of you are probably well aware of, is the system itself. It endures across all election cycles and administrations because it goes back to these perverted rules of the game. And the rules of the game in politics make these effective prisoners of even our senators and representatives themselves, because their only option is lockstep allegiance to their side of the divide. So naturally, the question is, what do we do about it? How do we change the rules of the game for Congress, the system of politics itself, and make it a win-win? So we have to focus on those rules. And what I will explain today is it's not the rules that we often think of that we need to focus on. It's not gerrymandering or the Electoral College or the fact that we don't have term limits or money in politics, really. If you look at politics through a competition lens at the system, politics industry theory illustrates two rules that are both our biggest obstacles and our biggest opportunities that are really hiding in plain sight. So let me quickly go over those two structural problems for you today. The first is our party primaries. So we already alluded to that, which is the fact that most of our elections today are really decided in the party primary. And as we all know, candidates are often pulled further to the right or further to the left than voters really want in their party primaries. And those party primaries, whoever makes it out of those party primaries is virtually guaranteed to win the general election because our elections are non-competitive within parties. So that's a problem in and of itself of simple representation. But that problem is even more acute when you think about the influence that that electoral system has, that party primary design, and how it extends into the calculus and the incentives when governing. Party primaries are actually one of the biggest structural contributors to the fact that we have gridlock almost always in Washington, D.C. So to illustrate that point, let me play out a thought experiment with you all. Imagine for a moment that you are a member of Congress, you are a federal elected representative, and it's unfortunately not just what you have to say when you're in running for election, when you're campaigning. The problem is that once you're in office and you're presented with an opportunity to consider some sort of landmark legislation, so think about whatever issue it is you care about. For me, it would be healthcare. You choose whatever your issue is. You probably know there's something we could do to make that better. There's a consensus-oriented, compromise, bipartisan, actual effective solution to our nation's biggest problems, almost all of them. There's things that we could do to make them better. So imagine, again, you're a member of Congress and you're looking at one of those common sense solutions to one of our nation's biggest challenges. you might expect that you're going to run through some questions in your head. You're going to think, well, when you're analyzing whether or not you should vote for this legislation, you might think to yourself, is this a good idea? Is it the right policy for the country? Or even you might think to yourself, is it what the majority of my constituents would want me to vote for? Those would be logical questions to ask yourself as an elected representative when looking at a piece of policy. But unfortunately, the question that you have to ask yourself above and beyond all of those questions is the question of, will I make it back through my party primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that question is no, and it virtually always is no on the biggest and most complicated issues, then all the previous questions about whether or not it's good policy and what your constituents want you to do are fundamentally irrelevant, because the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. Because if you vote yes on that consensus-oriented solution, you're going to be faced with a primary challenger, right? We all know that primary is no longer just a noun, it's also a verb, as in we are going to primary you if you step out of line and vote on something like that. So that's one of the biggest reasons that problem-solving politicians, that consensus-oriented solutions go nowhere in our nation's capital these days. The other reason that we don't get results in Congress is because there's no accountability for the fact that we don't get results. There's no accountability because we as voters, the customers in this industry of politics, only have two choices. In any other industry this big and thriving, with the degree of, frankly, customer dissatisfaction that we see in politics and only two players, there would be some sort of entrepreneur who would see it as a great opportunity to enter this market as a new competitor, respond to what customers want, and take on a new market share. But for some reason, that doesn't happen in politics. And that reason gets back to the fact that the barriers to entry in politics are astronomically high. The industry is effectively operating as a duopoly. And those barriers to entry, one of the biggest ones that we don't think about often enough is how we vote, this structural barrier to entry for new competition. And that gets to rule number 2. That is the rule around plurality voting. So again, it's not something we often think about because it's just kind of normal. We've always had plurality voting in our country, because when our country was young and our founders and framers were setting up our system of government, there were not a lot of examples of successful and enduring democracies. So they copied the electoral system that they were familiar with, that was in existence at the time in British countryside elections. And those elections declared that whoever wins that election is the candidate with the most votes, even if, importantly, that person did not receive a majority of votes. So you win with simple plurality of votes. So what plurality voting means in essence is that in any race with more than 2 candidates, the winner can win with actually far less than a majority of support. So imagine it for a second very simply. In a 3-way race, someone could win in a plurality voting system with 34% of the vote, meaning 66% of the electorate actually preferred someone else. So again, that's crazy design. It doesn't really seem fair, frankly, or representative again. But even more importantly, if you care about this effect of competition creating accountability in markets, is that plurality voting effectively eliminates any threat of substantive new competition to the duopoly, because plurality voting creates this effect that you've probably all heard of, which is the spoiler candidate or the wasted vote candidate. So again, right, we know how this goes. Sometimes we don't vote for the candidate who we really want to vote for because we're afraid that if we vote for them, we're going to effectively waste our vote, or more concerningly, spoil the election by helping to elect the candidate that we actually elect, that we like least. So that's why we're told time and time again that you shouldn't even run, right? So third party independent candidates don't run because you will simply be a spoiler. You will simply be a wasted vote. And it keeps people, qualified potentially people, from running even in the first place. So frankly, it doesn't matter if you like independent or third-party candidates or even inter-party competition within our two major parties, or you think we have fabulous candidates on the ballot already. I think we can all pause and understand that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system where having more talented and passionate competitors is somehow bad, particularly somehow bad for us as voters, as the consumers in this industry. Again, if you think about politics as an industry, it's one of the only industries where we are regularly told that somehow less competition is going to be better for us. And that shouldn't be, and it doesn't have to be. So the electoral innovation that we're working on at Democracy Found is called Final Five Voting, and it solves both of these problems, the problem in the party primary and the problem with plurality voting, by making two changes to how we vote. Again, one in the primary and one in the general election. And those two changes together encompass this change that we call Final Five Voting. So first step, get rid of party primaries. We make them up. Electoral rules, each state gets to set themselves. So our proposal changes to a single ballot top five primary. So quickly, here's how that works. Effectively, when you go in to vote in the primary, there's only one ballot, and all your candidates, no matter what their party affiliation is, and it includes independent and third-party candidates, all candidates in the primary are on the single ballot. And you vote for your favorite candidate. So let's see, in this particular election, I'm going to vote for the Green Bay Packers. They'll be my favorite candidate. And the top five finishers in that single ballot primary advance on to the general election. So the top five primary eliminates this party primary problem where we can primary each other within parties if people step out of line. And it gives legislators significantly more leeway to legislate in the public interest. So then we've got this effective competition, dynamic competition between five candidates in a general election where we can distinguish ourselves based on issues, based on credibility, based on experience as candidates. And we go in as voters and we have actual choice on that general election ballot. So how do we deal with the second problem with plurality voting? We have to make it so that in this five-way race, someone doesn't win with 21% of the vote, right? So we use a tool called instant runoff voting, which is enabled by a ranked choice ballot. And it works like this. I can go in the general election and I can vote for the Packers just like I did in the primary election. They'll be my favorite, and I can submit my ballot just like this, and it counts just like it does today. But if I want to tell you that if I can't have the Packers, I actually think the Bucks are pretty great. I like the Brewers. I don't really like the forward, and I definitely don't like the Admirals. I can rank as many or as few choices on my general election ballot as I, the voter, so choose. And what happens when the polls close is that we tabulate we count all the first place votes first. And if someone gets an actual majority, over 50% of the vote with first place votes, that candidate wins. They have majority support. But if no one gets 50% support with first place votes alone, a process of instant runoff elections occurs. So the last place candidate is automatically eliminated. They're out of the race. And if I voted for them, my votes are automatically transferred to my next choice. Tabulate again. If someone gets over 50%, election's over, they win. That process continues of elimination, dropping the lowest place candidate, and reallocation of their vote until you get to that true majority, broadest support winner. So you can imagine it's effectively a series of runoffs, but instead of having to come back time and time again for another election, you've cast all your votes at once. You've effectively showed us your preference through that ranked choice ballot. And instant runoff voting ensures that the candidate who wins has the broadest appeal to the most voters. and we don't end up in these odd situations where someone wins without a majority. So that's hugely important. But even more important, the benefit of instant runoff, if we're concerned about this problem of incentives and accountability to deliver results, is that all of a sudden the instant runoff eliminates barriers to new competition. The spoiler argument, the wasted vote argument, those are gone, because now we have healthy competition in the election, and it leads to a degree of accountability through our politics, so that politicians who win are incentivized to really solve problems and deliver results. So if you think back to that initial Venn diagram, you can think about how Final Five voting would change the calculus significantly, right? Because now politicians are incentivized to solve problems. They're accountable to the majority of their constituents. They want to do what we as a country need them to do, and they have the freedom electorally to do that. So imagine you're back in Congress again, and you're looking at that landmark piece of bipartisan legislation solving one of our biggest challenges. You can now vote yes for that solution. Because again, remember, under the old system, you never would have made it back for your party primary if you voted for that compromise. But now under the new system, you can definitely make it through a top 5 primary. You're an incumbent, right? You're doing a good job. And then in the general election, you're incentivized to get a coalition of support. You might get first choices, some second choices, maybe even some third choice votes, and craft those together to get a win. So the system, it really does realign incentives and accountabilities, because if we implement the top 5 primary and an instant runoff together at the same time, we free up politicians to do what needs doing, because they have a different set of electoral accountabilities. So before you think that I'm naive and overpromising some sort of crazy utopia of results and accountability demanding democracy these days, let me just clarify that I am not. I think Winston Churchill's quote is a good one to always remind ourselves that democracy is the worst form of government out there, except when compared to all the others, right? Because democracy is messy and it's hard. And what we have now is messy and hard with really terrible results to show for it. And with Final Five voting, we're certainly still going to have messy and hard, but every once in a while, we might have some good results to show for it. So most excitingly is that this electoral change is both powerful and it's achievable. So we have some proof in the pudding. In 2017, Catherine Gale, our co-founder here in Wisconsin, published one of her early works on politics industry theory through Harvard Business School. And the report made it all the way up to Alaska, where someone named Scott Kendall read it and took action. He used it to design a ballot initiative in Alaska that includes these new rules to electoral system design. And just a year ago, or a little over a year ago now, in November of 2020, the initiative passed in Alaska. So Alaska will be the first state in the nation to implement this change of they're doing a top 4 primary and an instant runoff general election in their 2022 elections in Alaska. And they certainly will not be the last, because again, as was already alluded to, we have introduced bipartisan legislation here in Wisconsin. State Senator Dale Koyenga and Jeff Smith and State Representative Tony Kurtz and Danny Reamer introduced legislation just earlier this year on Final Five voting for Wisconsin's federal elections. You can see traction is already growing. The La Crosse Tribune and the State Journal editorial boards have both editorialized in support of Final Five voting. And we've got co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle in both chambers of the legislature. So my work at Democracy Found really exists to advance this work and get it across the finish line in our state of Wisconsin. Before we dive into your questions, let me just say, there's far more that you can read about, learn about, share at democracyfound.org. That's the biggest ask here tonight, because honestly, I think it's important to note, as you all are probably more aware of and frustrated by than most of our population these days, I think it's really devastating to come to terms with how little we've come to expect from our politics. For some reason, we've decided that this state of affairs is somehow normal, right? We complain about it, but so many of us have mostly given up in believing that it's ever going to change. But that's no way to run our shining city on a hill that is America. We have the opportunity to choose different because our Constitution gives us that power. And I think our legislators here in the state truly believe that it also gives them the responsibility to remake our politics when we need to, and we certainly need to. So it is my pleasure to work on this every day and make sure that we are focusing not on red politics, not on blue politics, but on our politics collectively, and putting ourselves in a position where we can advance truly systemic and nonpartisan solutions like Final Five voting. So thank you for the opportunity to share a bit with you tonight about Final Five, and I really look forward to answering your questions in Q&A. Let me pause there.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to start with two questions that came in that are asking for clarification on your remarks before we go into questions, like deeper questions. One question is, did I understand that a voter can vote for as many candidates as they want? And what about write-ins? So can you explain the process again and address write-ins?
Yeah, great question. Clearly, we have an audience that is familiar with electoral systems. So I was going to throw up slides here, but actually I don't think that's going to help. Let me just talk through it. So yeah, in this system, you can vote for, in the primary, one candidate. So vote for your favorite and the top 5 advance. And then the opportunity in the general election to write in an option still exists on a ranked choice ballot. It's just you get 5 rankings and you would choose to include your write-in candidate as one of your rankings. So there would still be a line for write-ins on that ballot that people get to choose to vote for. So effectively, you can vote for as many or as few candidates as you want, and your ballot, your votes essentially remain in the rounds of runoffs as long as you have preferences who are still in the race. So actually, I do think it is going to be kind of helpful. I'm going to throw up here on the slide. We often do, when we're in person, a mock election because it's so helpful to just kind of walk through how a Final Five election actually works. So these are some election results that we did at the Greater Milwaukee Committee. So these are actual results. So, right, you go through, we already looked at this, the top 5 primary, vote for your favorite. The top 5 vote getters advance to the general election. As I already showed you, vote for as many or as few candidates as you want. And then here's how the tabulation works. I think this is what some of the questions are getting into. You count all the first place votes first. So this is first place votes tabulated. And you see that none of the candidates had over 50% support in this particular election. So the Bucks were actually ahead with the plurality. This is an easier way to see how these votes were allocated. So the Bucks had 30% support, but the Brewers and the Packers were really close behind in this election. So this would trigger the rounds of instant runoffs automatically. So you drop the candidate who came in last. So now the forward are effectively out of the race, and anyone who voted for them, if they ranked a second choice, so you'll see in this election, these little gray guys are going to move to where their second choices were. So again, in this particular case, they all happened to rank the Brewers second. So their votes were reallocated, moved over. Their single vote was transferred effectively. Their single vote was transferred to their next choice. And it's right, still no one has over 50%. So you do it again. And then you do it again until someone, right, crosses that threshold of 50% support. So you can see that even though the Packers didn't have plurality support, they had broadest support amongst the entire electorate, getting them over 50%. So that's how those single vote transfers effectively work in a Final Five election. I hope that clarified to some degree. Let me stop sharing here.
Thank you. Another question that's sort of a point of clarification. What do you mean when you say 10% of the voters elect 86% of Congress?
Yeah, it's a staggering statistic, isn't it? So what that means is effectively, when you look at who is electing someone, it's the primary electorate who's electing whoever wins. So it's the voters in a party primary in various states who are effectively saying who the candidate is who wins. So when you look at, of the entire vote share, 10% of the electorate is determining who wins that general election, because the general election is non-competitive. So it's basically the vote share from the primary election that in so many of our elections for Congress are effectively the ones who are deciding, because they're the people who voted in their party primaries for the winner in that particular election.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk a little bit about other countries, cities, or counties that already have instant runoff elections?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ranked choice ballots have been around for a long time. Other countries have been using this system of effectively ranking candidates for a century. Ireland, Australia, other places. I always like to throw in the fact that when our experts on democracy now go out to other forming democracies, we actually don't recommend, as the United States, our form of government anymore when we are starting or helping to advise on forming of new democracies. So that's pretty shocking, but it's true. So the idea of this, how do we have a majority rule system, has been around in other places for a very long time. It's gained a lot of traction at the municipal level in other states. There are 14 states across the country that use ranked choice ballots in their local elections and their nonpartisan local elections. So for us, that would be like our mayor, city council, school board elections, or spring elections effectively. And the state of Maine uses ranked choice voting for their state and federal elections. They just use it a little differently. They use it within their party primary and then in the general election. So it's a different system, but uses the same sort of ballot. And fundamentally, one of the values of this experimentation that our federalist system allows for is that as other places are ahead of us in this, frankly, the technology has evolved. So all new voting machines can process a ranked choice ballot now, which is pretty amazing because so many municipalities are doing it. So the technological barriers to implementation that you might be worried about are just not, they're not there anymore when you look at how technology has evolved. Obviously, you're still voting on a paper ballot. You have a paper record, an auditable trail. You can also hand count ranked choice ballots. Ireland has like a week of tabulation where they joke it's almost like, for political nerds, it's political TV drama as they reallocate the votes as they go through the rounds of counting. I think I would be one of the very few people who might find that particularly entertaining and interesting, but it's just a way of doing things that has been culturally has become culturally accepted. And I think the voters can see then, one of the values is they can see their vote mattering, because effectively right now, one of the main reasons we hear from voters that they don't vote is because they don't feel that their vote will matter. And unfortunately, in so many places, that's not wrong. It is effectively true that your vote doesn't really matter if you are, not of the majority party in your particular district in the general election. Your vote isn't really going to matter. But in this system, you get the freedom to really express your full preference, and your elected representative can see that there is there's a chunk of support out there for this particular candidate who maybe ran on a set of issues that might not have been the biggest issues, but they got a significant portion of the electorate. So maybe as the main party candidate who won, I now want to think about how I get those people to be part of my coalition of winning support next time around. Maybe I should pay attention to them because I might get their second or even their third preference in the future. So it really does re-incentivize the way politicians think about their electorate, but also voters think about how their vote matters. So I went way off the question of where has this been implemented, but I just get excited about it. So there are lots of meaningful reasons to make this change, and other states and municipalities have really been pioneering the way. The other thing I should say is that in addition to the 14 states that use municipal level instant runoff elections, there are also, I believe, 7 states that use instant runoffs for military and overseas ballots already. And some of those are overlapping, but some of those are additional states. So there really is widespread, even within our country, use of the instant runoff election process, even right now.
Okay. And here's a follow-up to the beginning of your answer on this one about machines. Would this require new voting machines? You say the machines are capable, but does that mean the machines that our municipalities in Wisconsin already have?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as you all probably know better than most, we are one of the most decentralized election administration states in the country. So the answer is it depends. It depends on where you are in your local jurisdiction. So some local jurisdictions do have the capabilities right now, either with the current machines that they own or with a simple software upgrade to process ranked choice ballots. Some of them are still hand counting in Wisconsin. There are still jurisdictions, small villages and others that are hand counting ballots. You can, as I mentioned, you can hand count ranked choice ballots. It is possible. Gets a little bit more challenging with larger election turnouts, but it really does depend on where you are within the state, what your technology looks like. But we've done an analysis, and there's certainly some upgrades that would need to be made. But honestly, a lot of jurisdictions are going through upgrade processes anyway. As you all probably know, most of the elections equipment was really purchased back after the 2000 election. There was a big influx of federal money for upgrades to systems, and there has not been a big influx since. So a lot of those machines are getting to the end of their useful life, and different jurisdictions are already going through their own rounds of updating. So depending on where you are, your jurisdiction might have already updated their machines to be of these, machines that were developed in the last few years who are able to process ranked choice ballots.
Okay. And I'll remind people again, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. The next question is, isn't the trend toward lockstep voting the real problem? How does this proposal fix that problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this proposal is specifically aimed at that, which is to say the push towards lockstep voting is very rational right now in our current electoral system, because if you vote outside of lockstep allegiance with your side or the other side, right, you are effectively throwing your vote away, because you are very unlikely to win or influence the outcome of the election. So in this system, now you have the ability to vote for someone else without throwing your vote away. You can signify that your first place vote might be with an independent or a third party candidate, and you can put your second choice with the Republican or Democratic candidate. So it makes it so that voters have real choices again, as opposed to our current binary where voters really are incentivized to stick in lockstep with one side or the other, and not to put any pressure even within those parties. So you can also think about this as, in our current system, a lot of people get excited about term limits because there's frustration with incumbents just kind of staying forever and never really having any threat to their incumbency. And this is another mechanism by which we can hold our elected officials accountable towards delivering results. And the power of incumbency isn't quite as great in a system like this, where all of a sudden new competition can enter into the marketplace of politics, and voters can have real choices for those new for that new competition. And I should say, I took the question to mean problem with lockstep from voters' perspective, but there's also a problem of lockstep on politicians' perspective. So let me take it from that angle as well, which is to say this problem of lockstep voting, as in, as a Republican, you can only vote for what the majority Republican leaders tell you to do. As a Democrat, you can only vote for what your majority leaders, Democratic leaders, tell you to do. And that is where, again, I think this system of final five voting shows real promise, because all of a sudden, there's a little bit less power because you can't be threatened. So often we hear from elected officials that they'd love to do X, Y, and Z, but if they do, step out of line, right? Get out of that lockstep, step out of line, they'll get a primary against them, whether that be from their fringe base or from party leadership for stepping out of line. Whoever is holding them accountable for stepping out of line will throw a primary challenge at them. And this system makes that threat of primary challenge really just far less meaningful, because in a top five primary, you can't weed people out through those low turnout elections in the same way. So it allows for people to do the things that the majority of us want them to do. We know there are so many issues, right, where 85% of the public says, yes, this is a common sense solution that we'd like to see advanced, and nothing happens on those things because it's not ideologically pure enough for either side of the divide, and so nothing happens. Well, now, if it's something that the majority of the electorate wants, there's actually some incentive for politicians to respond to that majority of the electorate, because that's who they're accountable to electorally.
Okay. There are two questions that ask for clarification of the instant runoff process. I think one person is asking, could you go back to the screen where the last place was eliminated? Where exactly did those votes go? And someone else asking essentially, but for an explanation of how the instant runoff works.
Yeah, let's do this part. Let me take it a little bit slower. So, right, this is the first round of an instant runoff on the screen. So this is first place votes. And as you can see, no one has 50%. So you drop the Madison forward. That candidate is now effectively out of the race. And their votes, you can see, they moved here underneath the Brewers. So that happens again. We go through another round of tabulation, is how we refer to it, and drops the Admirals. See all these guys, these little blue guys? They're going to move to their second choices. And you see some of them went to the Bucks, some of them went to the Brewers, some of them went to the Packers. They kind of went across the remaining candidates. And it happens again, where now the Bucks are out of the race, and you've got all these people whose now second choice starts to matter. And these guys, their third choice starts to matter, and they move accordingly. So you can see they fell into various places as well, but more of them fell under, ranked the Packers second or third than the Brewers. So ultimately the Packers win. So what that means through these rounds of tabulation is that effectively, if you voted for the Packers as your first place vote, your next choices in the runoff never really come into play, because your candidate effectively stays in the race all through these rounds of runoff. So if you think about it as a traditional runoff, it's like your candidate is the one who keeps making it onto the next round of ballots to vote again, but your candidate is just still in the race. So your votes never transfer. The only votes that transfer are for the candidates who get dropped out of the race for being in last place. Hopefully that clarified some of the questions.
Oops, it helps to unmute. Okay. How can this change come about? What are the benefits that would make this attractive to incumbents to support it?
It's a good question. So I keep saying that. It's a good question. So many good questions. So We have some really phenomenal champions in Wisconsin, so I'll just shout them out because we've been really pleased to work with. If you're familiar with Congressman Mike Gallagher from the Green Bay area, he's been very supportive of Final Five voting. And I think he explains it. I love the way he explains it, which is to say, he got to Congress after serving in the military and thought that Congress was going to be another way to extend his service. Logical, wonderful, patriotic, one might almost say, right? And then got to Congress and realized, oh my gosh, this place, it's totally dysfunctional because the only options that are available to us are lockstep allegiance with our side. So it gets back to that question we talked about earlier. And a lot of that is because the options that you have in front of you in Congress these days are to create your platform, to derive your power, either from the traditional method of working your way up through the system, right? Raising the money, doing what the leadership tells you to do, going through the committee process, trying to get a chairmanship on a leading committee like Ways and Means, gather your power that way. But interestingly, in the recent decades, there's an alternative path to raising power in Congress, which is to say, becoming a bomb thrower. So you can also get a power in Congress these days by being a Twitter maven, by preaching to MSNBC or Fox News audiences, to just driving your own power and base up by this method of bomb throwing. And neither of those ways are particularly efficient ways to get things done. If your goal is to go into Congress and solve problems and serve for a few terms and do your public service and then move on to other areas of life, that's not really what either of those paths incentivize. So if you are an incumbent who is frustrated by that, and I think far more are frustrated by the current dynamics than we like to give them credit for. So Mike will also say this, which is to say, so often I think from the outside, we think, gosh, these people are just power hungry. They're in it for the wrong reasons. It's easy to demonize politicians, frankly. But he said he was surprised that when he got there, how many good people were trying to do the right thing, but the incentives, the system kept getting in the way of getting that done. So that's what gives me hope, is that even the incumbents who are in the system, they're almost the biggest victims of it because they can't do what it is that needs to be done, that they want to do, that needs doing, because the system is constantly getting in their way to doing that. So they have every incentive to try to make a new possibility for themselves, a new path towards governing, towards delivering results. And frankly, if they don't do it, the electorate is getting so frustrated and so alienated by Congress that, the risks are too great to Congress not figuring out how to deliver. And I do believe, based on the fact that I have conversations with incumbent politicians all the time, that there's more demand out here for this sort of change than one might expect at face value, because they too recognize that this path that we're on is not a sustainable one.
Okay, thank you. Got a couple of questions where they're wondering about the effects of gerrymandering on this proposal.
Yeah, so the beauty of Final Five voting is that whoever wins is winning in a general election. So I think when many of us get frustrated by gerrymandering, what we're really frustrated about is actually this primary problem, which is that in districts that are so red or so blue that effectively there's no real partisan competition, there's no real choice on the general election ballot, because we already know who's going to win, because it's going to be whoever made it out of the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, depending on if it's a red district or a blue district. So if that is what is concerning to you, the partisan nature of gerrymandering and the fact that it precludes electoral competition, Final Five voting is a way to get around that, because even if And if you are a person who doesn't think gerrymandering, thinks gerrymandering is just a natural occurrence based on how we self-segregate based on geography, again, Final Five voting is also a solution to that, because effectively we now have competition, inter-party competition. So if a district is going to be a red district, you might have multiple Republicans running against each other in that general election. So now you have real choice between Republicans. You have real choice between Democrats in a Democratic district. And if you are not of the in party in that district, your vote might start to matter, because if you might vote for, let's say you are in, well, you're a Milwaukee County. Let's say you are in solidly blue Milwaukee and you are a Republican in solidly blue Milwaukee. Your vote doesn't matter right now, right? And a lot of people would say that's because of gerrymandering. But effectively, even if we had nonpartisan commissions drawing lines, Milwaukee is going to be solidly blue, right? So the only way to make that Republican vote start to matter in Milwaukee County is to say, okay, vote for your, maybe the Republican is now going to vote for the Republican on the general election ballot as their first choice, but they might vote for the more moderate Democrat as their second choice, or the independent as their second choice. So effectively, you are giving power to all voters in a general electorate through Final Five voting, which gets at that underlying frustration, I believe, that led so many of us to thinking that gerrymandering and nonpartisan redistricting was the solution. But unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is that that's not solution enough if you really care. If competition is the problem that you are concerned about, if healthy electoral competition is your ultimate goal, simply moving to an independent commission is not going to solve that problem for us.
Okay. How would you propose that this type of voting would be communicated to voters? What is the likely effect on voter participation? Just how would the education piece be done?
Yeah, one of the great things is that we have data on that, because so many places have done ranked choice ballots even for their local elections. So what we've learned is that even in those, frankly, lowest information, lowest turnout elections, I don't have to tell the league how hard it is to get people to turn out for spring primary and spring general elections, right? You all know. But in those low information elections, voters still in jurisdictions that have implemented ranked choice voting said that they fully understood, they appreciated the opportunity to rank on their ballots. There were more jurisdictions used an instant runoff process this past fall. They're in places that had fall 2021 elections than have ever used it before. And the vast majority, I think it was in Utah, about 20 cities used ranked choice voting. And of those cities, in the exit polling that was done, 90% of the electorate said they understood the directions, they understood how to rank their ballots. And I believe it was something like over 60% of the electorate said that they really, they wanted to expand. They liked ranked choice voting, they liked the instant runoff process, and they wanted to expand use of it in their state to other elections. So it certainly does take education of voters, but that grid ballot is, with a good set of instructions on top of it, it's not super confusing to voters, because we actually rank things in our lives all the time. We don't often think about it as ranking things, but imagine, you all probably went through a process when you considered what you wanted to make for dinner tonight. So I was thinking, right, I was like, well, I could cook here at home, or I could go out and get takeout. Let me think, what are my options? I could make blah, 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 right? And we go through these options and we kind of rank them in our head all the time. If I can't have chocolate ice cream, I'll take caramel, I'll take whatever. We go through that ranking process. So it's not a ranking, it's not a challenge for voters if you give them good instruction and some education on it. And we've seen in places that have implemented that voters really like the process.
Okay. Would money in politics remain a strong influencer on candidate behavior under ranked choice voting? Every candidate needs campaign financing.
It's absolutely true. Money speaks, right? Money speaks in all industries. And I don't want to pretend that final five voting is going to be some sort of silver bullet that's going to, already promised, right? It's not going to make our politics perfect. There's no way. So there will certainly be a role for money in politics in this system, just like there is in our current system. One of the most interesting things to me is a little bit of a nuanced argument, but I'll share it with you all this evening, which is to say, in our current system, money is incredibly powerful because it has a direct return on investment, because we know who's going to win. So think about it for a second. If you are an investor and you know solidly who's going to win, who's going to, perform well, so in our electoral system, that would mean win. It's easy to invest your money in that person and have a guaranteed return. So in our system of a non-competitive general elections, it's very easy to invest money in politics with clear return, if you use that analogy. In the system of final five, all of a sudden this dynamic of competition interrupts that somewhat, which is to say, yes, money will still matter because you need money to get out your name out there, to do your doors, to hire your people, to all the things that you need money for in campaigns. But all of a sudden, the special interest power that comes with money in the current system is a little less powerful, because all of a sudden votes matter in a general election too, because there's actual competition in that general election. It's not a preordained outcome who's going to win. So certainly money will still factor in a final five election, but I think there is an argument to be made that the power of special interest money in elections might be slightly less powerful under a final five system than under our current electoral system.
Okay, here's what, when there is power and money involved, there's an incentive for individuals and groups to figure an end around to any system. What end arounds have occurred in states or countries using this system, and have other changes occurred to disrupt those end arounds?
Yeah, exactly. So I mentioned this federalist system of election administration in our country, which is to say these experiments around opening up primaries, using instant runoffs, have happened all over the place. One of the things that we've learned from the experimentation on open primaries in states like California and Washington State, who moved to a top two primary system, is that two candidates is not enough. So final five is in some ways a response to that, which is to say, okay, advance five candidates forward and then pair with this other innovation of using instant runoffs to get to more accountability. So we have tried to take some learnings from the current system. One of the things that we've also learned from ranked choice at the municipal level is that if you don't limit the number of candidates for ranking to some sort of manageable number, that's where it can start to get a little bit confusing. So the example that's always thrown out there is kind of a gotcha question, is like, wow, what about that time in Minneapolis when they had 35 candidates for mayor, and then we expected voters to rank 35 candidates? Well, that does seem a little bit crazy, right? But the top five, again, is a way to solve for that. So I don't mean to say that there won't be something in the future that's going to disrupt this system of final five voting and find some way around it. But to date, we've had a lot of really smart political people run as many scenarios and experimentations as possible and have not found the way yet to break it. But certainly in the coming decades, if we were to implement this, I'm sure they would find a way, and it would be incumbent on us as citizens in this republic to continue to innovate and solve for those things as they came along. That's the nature of how our country was formed, in such a way that we don't prescribe how elections are run. The Constitution doesn't dictate that, because we are responsible for continuing to create that accountability over time. So I don't have a great answer as to what has happened, because we don't have that evidence to date yet on final five. but we have tried to learn from the experiments on both the open primaries experiments and the instant runoff experiments in creating this combined reform of Final Five voting.
Okay, it's 8:32, and I don't think we're going to have time to get through all of these questions. So I'm going to try to distill this one. Historically, the political party consensus has sorted out the candidates. Doesn't this further weaken the influence of the political parties?
Great question, and one we've struggled with political scientists with a lot, because if you look at political science literature, it's exactly true that political scientists will tell you that there's an argument to be made for strengthening of parties, and that is one of the ways to solve for some of our challenges facing our democracy right now. So one of the values of Final Five is that we don't take away the role of parties entirely. There's still party affiliation on ballots. There's still party power in their endorsement processes. There's still party power in who they choose to put their support behind. And so in some ways, so Wisconsin was the state that took party primaries out of the smoke-filled rooms during the La Follette progressive era in the early 1900s and said, no, parties shouldn't have all this power of deciding who wins, who gets the nomination. We should give that power to the people through the party primary process, give that power to voters. And exactly actually to the previous question, I think over time we've seen the influence in that party primary process, special interests playing in, the money playing in, the party interests playing in, really corrode that originally good intention. And it's time for us to solve for that again in Wisconsin and lead the way in innovating in our system to continue to refine and solve for the challenges that we are seeing. So this system is in no way designed to limit the power of parties or the role of parties. It is simply a way to make sure that we are holding the parties accountable for delivering results and making it so that if they are not delivering, there's actually possibility for competition to ensure that that happens. So we may very well still have two major parties after this system, but they shouldn't be guaranteed to be the only two parties forever and ever, even if they aren't delivering any results. That's just not healthy for our republic.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry for everyone that we couldn't get to every question, but you can send your questions to Sarah, that's SARA, sarah@democracyfound.org for follow-up, and democracyfound.org is the organization's website as well. So I thank you. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, we have to unmute, don't we? This is Elizabeth Lantini on behalf of the Milwaukee County League of Women Voters. I want to express my sincere thanks to Sarah for what was a highly interesting, really very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I know that I came in much more skeptically than I think I'm leaving. So I look forward to catching more of the conversation in the future. So with that, I think that we are ending the Zoom. Again, thank you, Sarah. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you all so much. I appreciated being with you.
Thank you.